Asian Development Bank estimates that 80% of Asia's economic growth will be generated in its urban areas, which are currently witnessing rapid migration and motorization. It's estimated that by 2030, nearly half of the world's projected 1.5 billion vehicles will be in Asia. The urban transportation sector is a major source of CO2 emissions in countries like China and India, with the majority coming from cars that, despite the rise of EVs, remain largely dependent on oil-based fuels. As population growth, motorization, and climate change strain urban mobility in the region, the design and delivery of transport services are becoming increasingly complex. With countries exploring sustainable mobility solutions and the adoption of electric and autonomous vehicles accelerating, what role do technology driven innovations play in decarbonizing transport and improving mobility experiences, especially considering issues of equity and access to affordable urban mobility? In today's episode of Code Green, we are joined by Hue-Tam Jamme and Kris Villanueva-Libunao to explore the future of AI and sustainable mobility in Asia. Hello and welcome to Code Green, a podcast series where we explore the intersection of climate change and artificial intelligence in Asia. I'm Urvashi Aneja, the founder and director of Digital Futures Lab. We are an India-based research organization that examines the impact of technology on society in the global south. Through evidence-based research, systematic foresight, and public engagement, we work to realize equitable, safe, and sustainable digital futures for all. This podcast is accompanied by a monthly newsletter where we showcase the latest scientific and socio-technical research at the intersection of AI and climate action. You can access both the podcast and our newsletter at codegreen.asia. Code Green is supported by Earth Venture Foundation, a not-for-profit initiative that supports scientific research to advance climate action. Our guests today are Hue-Tam Jamme and Kris Villanueva-Libunao. Hue-Tam Jamme is Assistant Professor at Arizona State University of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, where she researches how emerging technologies reshape urban spaces and mobility patterns in transit-oriented development. Using mixed methods to explore how we can create more equitable and accessible urban environments, she works globally on car-free living, automated retail, and platform economies. Kris Villanueva-Libunao is the Executive Director and Chief Sustainability Officer at Smart CT. With almost a decade of policy research, consultancies with government agencies, international government organizations, and private companies, Kris is on a mission to change how the world thinks, does, and plans smart cities in the Philippines and developing countries. In this episode, we explore why cities need equitable, people-centered planning that accounts for existing mobility patterns rather than banking solely on technology, which can exacerbate existing social inequities and overlook accessibility concerns. Hue-Tam offers the concept of productive frictions, delving into the impacts of mobility infrastructure and transport modes on socio-economic and cultural urban activity. With a decade of observation and study in motorbike-oriented cities like Ho Chi Minh City, she emphasizes the role of political will in shaping new transport modes that should not only support networks of economic activity but also enhance urban vibrancy and cultures. Kris looks at the barriers of urban mobility in Asia: congestion, emissions, aging infrastructure, and accessibility gaps. She juxtaposes AI's potential to improve traffic management, sustainability, and safety, as seen in countries like Singapore, Japan, and Korea, with the need for strong data governance and capacity building as crucial building blocks for AI-driven solutions to be implemented equitably in developing economies within the region. Together, they advocate for a people-centric approach to AI for urban mobility, urging stakeholders to view transportation infrastructure as systems that impact people's economic, social, and cultural lives. Let's jump right into the conversation. Thank you both for joining us. Hue-Tam, maybe I can start with you. So you've been doing fieldwork on mobility around the world, examining the trajectory of transport-oriented development. So could you tell our listeners what transport-oriented development is and what does this mean in the Asian context? And perhaps in that introduction also just reflect a little bit on what role does technology play in transport-oriented development?
Yeah, sure. So transit-oriented development, as the name indicates, it's all about integration. It's about making sure that the way we plan transportation and the way we plan land uses allow for a lifestyle where people can rely on public transit every day to go home, to go to work, to do their shopping on the way. So it's about planning land uses, especially around transit station area, in a way that make it possible for people to access, maybe on foot, or maybe using first, like as we call them, first last mile transportation mode. So it could actually be maybe nowadays a scooter, or a ride that you would request on an app, so that you can then access your final destination from the transit station. But transit oriented development is all about making sure that those connections are smooth, and that having the public transit system as basically the backbone of your transportation experiences every day. It's so basically it's possible that from a transit station to another, you're able to not depend on a car, in addition to or instead of public transit. So, in a sense, it's really interesting because there are certain criteria that are associated with good TOD, as we call it. So, for example, for a very long time, like some criteria that have been identified are like high density. There are like these, density, diversity, good pedestrian oriented design. So these are the like basic 3 Ds of transit oriented development. And it's really important to emphasize those dimensions in contexts where they are not there. Like the TOD concept was first coined in the United States, in the Western United States, in cities that were planned for cars. So it's really difficult when you have like a new metro system, say, that comes to Los Angeles. It's really challenging to retrofit the city so that it becomes denser, more diverse, and with a better design, one that is not made for cars, but that's made for pedestrians. It's really important to emphasize and retrofit the city so that it becomes more transit oriented. But in Asian cities that are, organically, they have developed as dense cities, as diverse cities where you have like a mix of people where they live, where they shop, where they work, all of that is all mingled together. In a sense, it's like the existing city is more conducive to transit oriented development. So the integration, in a sense, can be seen as it should be easier to do it, But you have like other challenges in Vietnam where people rely on motorbikes a lot as a mode of transportation to go from wherever you are to wherever you need to be. That when you have a new transit system, a metro system coming in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City like today, it's another set of challenges. The density, the diversity are there. The design is not good. We cannot say that it's pedestrian oriented, that it's conducive to walking to the station. It's not good in that sense. It's good in other ways. But the challenge is to make the new transit system competitive with the existing form of mobility. And I think there is a role for technology to play there, in particular in providing mobility on demand. Like that's a type of new forms of mobility. All the services that apps like Ola or Grab or Uber around the world are providing. I think there's really something there in what the challenge will be is this first last mile connection, making sure that people from the station can get to wherever they need to be. And I think this is where technology can play a role in meeting that demand.
And you see some of this kind of transit oriented development already underway in the Asian context. Like how alive or mature a conversation is this in the sites that you studied or the cities that you studied?
Well, it's a really good question. So it's interesting because the way that I got to interested in transportation was back now 10 years ago. I was involved in transit oriented development around the new transit systems that like in particular in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and Dhaka in Bangladesh. And I was particularly involved in the TOD studies. And there was very little interest. So we were at the early planning stages. I mean, the lines were on, like, construction was beginning. Talked about the big D's, but there are other criteria around transit oriented development. One of them is the real integration of the station in the buildings, in the built environment. So you have this idea that good transit oriented development, you would have like a really smooth transition from being in the neighborhood to being inside the station. So you would really have, I guess, some exemplary, like really well integrated stations. I saw them recently in Singapore, like where you have, you're basically in a shopping center with apartment buildings on the upper floors, and on the ground floor you have an access to the station that's underground, but all of that is part of the same ensemble. It's part of the same complex. And the entrance, the access to the station is a public space, is a public plaza where you have good signage, you have good access, and all of that is well integrated and well designed. So when I was involved in the planning of metro lines in Asian cities where the metros are under development now, in the early stages when this was the time, to organize the land and plan for land uses just around in the immediate vicinity of the stations in ways that are truly integrated, there was little interest, let's say. And there's something political about it as well, in the sense that this land, when you're so close to a metro station coming, becomes extremely valuable. So organizing public access, organizing some public uses and some integrated uses, there's also speculation going on around those transit station in these transit station areas. So ideally you would want some, say, affordable housing developed near transit, so that everyone, can live and depend on transit for their to support their everyday life. Let's say that maybe some, corporations, or some, even politically, it might not be the most appealing use of the land. So it's really contested. That land is really contested and makes it truly difficult in certain contexts to do good transit oriented development.
Yeah, I think that definitely resonates with some of my experience in India, where so much of this is also about the kind of political will as well as the kind of systems thinking, when we're building these kind of interventions. And what we see, at least in the Indian context, is a lot of new kind of transit solutions, but then the kind of last mile connectivity or the access to services, housing, all the other stuff that needs to kind of support that hasn't quite been thought of with the same level of kind of focus. Kris, maybe I can turn to you now. So AI sounds like a buzzword in the transport sector. We hear a lot around AI in transport, AI in mobility, but when we were actually doing some research on this, we saw that there was really not much information on types of use cases or actual use of AI within the transport sector and what AI could actually solve for. So what are some of the main kind of challenges for urban mobility in Asia, and what role do you see AI is playing in addressing these issues?
Yeah, I think you already Wei already pointed out some challenges in Asia when it comes to urban mobility and transit oriented design. Well, as you all know, urban mobility in Asia is grappling with a lot of challenges. First off would be congestion. Congestion is a huge issue in cities like Manila and Jakarta. Traffic jams are a daily struggle. According to a 2023 report, even 257 hours are wasted just being stuck in traffic annually in Manila. So that's 10 full days of wasted time just stuck in traffic in Manila. Then of course there's this aging infrastructure as well. A lot of transit systems in the region are quite outdated and it can't handle the demand, the growing demand, which already was mentioned but way earlier as well. When I worked with as a consultant with the Department of Transportation in the Philippines, we found out that majority of the urban transit infrastructures desperately need upgrades as well. So next would be accessibility. Accessibility is another big hurdle because low income and rural communities often get left behind when it comes to urban, what they call this, the urban infrastructure development. Our research at Smart City showed that a significant number of low income Filipinos in urban areas rely on informal transit like jeepneys, motorcycles, because formal systems just don't reach their particular areas. So accessibility is really, really a big hurdle as well. And of course, last but not the least would be sustainability. That's a pressing concern because transportation accounts for nearly 25% of Southeast Asians carbon emissions. So that's according to the ADB report as well. So those are the challenges that I see thus far. Congestion, aging infrastructure, accessibility, and of course, sustainability.
And what role do you see AI playing in addressing some of these issues? Are there already some use cases or applications that you see that are being developed to address some of these issues?
So the question is, how does AI help when it comes to this particular challenges? I believe it's, you mentioned earlier that it might be a hype, but I believe it's not a hype if and when done well. It can be a game changer, in fact, if it's done right. So for congestion, AI can analyze real time data, tweak traffic signals, develop countries in Asia has been doing this already. We mentioned Singapore. The Singapore Transport Authority has been doing this real-time traffic management. So basically, I believe 15% they were able to cut the commute times, 15% with AI-driven traffic management. So that's a given already. Next would be perhaps transit efficiency as well. AI can predict maintenance. I mentioned earlier aging infrastructure. AI can predict maintenance when it comes to road infrastructure and of course optimize routes. Japan did this already. Even boosted their train punctuality by 20% using AI. Safety is another win. AI powered systems like driver assistance could cut down accidents. This is very important because in the Philippines alone, there has been 12,000 traffic accidents daily. So AI can reduce the traffic accidents through driver assistance themselves. And of course, for sustainability, so this particular project, it's called Mobility over Air Quality Index, which aims to gauge the relative changes in levels of air pollution and the mobility of the people. How does this change, especially during COVID time, because there's a lot of population moving towards the rural area rather than the urban area. So AI can also gauge this particular changes in air quality. So yeah, from my experience, AI's real value in tailoring it to this particular challenges can be a game changer, and not a hype if and done right, really.
Thanks, Chris. Maybe just two kind of follow up questions on that. One is to ask that are some of these uses already in play? Like, do you already see, like you'd mentioned, like in Japan, we're already using AI for transit efficiency. Are there other? I mean, are there other examples where these technologies are already in play, or is it more of a kind of hypothetical, theoretical possibility at the moment that we should be able to get there, and we need to figure out how we get there? And then maybe the second question is that how much of this is, I mean, just coming back to the question around hype, I guess, around AI, like how much of this is actually AI and how much of this is kind of more old school kind of data analytics that are being used? And what is the difference in the context of transit systems?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of AI projects in developed countries. I've mentioned about Korea. I've mentioned about I mentioned about Singapore, and of course, I mentioned about Japan. In developing countries like the Philippines, sadly, the change of leadership plays a role as well if when it comes to the continuity of the project. So while there are good projects, continuity is a question. Yeah. So to answer your question, yeah, it's not a hype. It's there already. And it's been experienced by developed countries and being sustained there. When it comes to your another question, right? So is it really AI, or is it just, typical data analytics? I believe when it comes to the gargantuan amount of data and the predictability, that's where the AI comes in. And we can witness it in Japan. We can witness it in Singapore already. But then again, developing countries example are still, very few and quite siloed, really.
Yeah, and I think those are really interesting points that you make also, that the technology might be available and might be very good and very useful, but we also need to think about the kind of local context and whether there's political will or institutional readiness, capacity, like all of this will also make a big difference in the technology that might be available and actually contributing to some of the outcomes that we desire. Um, Hue-Tam, to come back to you, so we see kind of rapid mobility transitions happening across Asia, and it's producing what you call kind of productive frictions, especially in the case of Vietnam. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by productive frictions and how you study them?
Sure. Yeah, predictive friction is a concept that's very much at the center of my research agenda. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of access. It's a new way of thinking about accessibility and thinking about the impacts of mobility transitions. So, the way that I came to think about productive friction is through my observation of people riding motorbikes every day for to meet all of their transportation needs in Vietnamese cities. So what I observed is that when you're like also myself, like through my own experiences navigating this Vietnamese streets on motorbikes, but my observations are that when you're riding a motorbike in a very dense and diverse city, you end up being constantly in contact with your surroundings, with the places and the people around you. And every step along the way, just like if you were walking in some ways, every step along the way is an opportunity for you to participate in some form of activity. If you have to drop off your kid on the way, if you want to, you see something on the side of the road that you feel like buying, it's easy to stop and make your purchase and keep going. If you see a coffee shop, and you haven't had breakfast yet, you might want to stop there and stop for a quick coffee. That's something that's a very common practice in the Vietnamese city. And the point that I made, this is what I call productive friction, is this constant contact along the way, where every step along the way is an opportunity for some interaction with the places and the people around you. In a city where a motorbike centric city, you have a very high level of productive friction on the entire street network, because the streets, just the way they are designed, like the ground floor of the of basically every building in Vietnamese city is some form of retail or institutional use. So you'll have something to do on the ground floor of every building, more or less, if you're riding on the larger roads and boulevards. So you have a very high level of productive friction. It's kind of continuous. And what I've argued is that in that context, the mobility transition that's happening now towards more modern transportation modes, so what is seen as more modern is basically cars and mass transit as well. But what I've argued is from the perspective of productive friction, that will change the network, where the productive friction will be concentrated. And the experience of driving a car in the Vietnamese city is one where you have very low productive friction, because you do have very low opportunity for interacting with the places and the people around you, primarily because you have nowhere to stop. It's really difficult to park. You don't really have on-street parking. The streets are just too narrow and too busy for that. So driving a car in that context is not very different from going through a tunnel. You will have productive friction where you start if there is something to interact with, like at your origin point. You might have productive friction at your destination. You probably have a destination in mind, so there's probably something to do there. But along the way, there will be very little to no productive friction. As for a city that works, that functions, that's structured by a mass transit system, well, the productive friction nodes will probably be around transit stations. Going back to the notion of transit-oriented development, that at nodes on the network, you will probably have, transportation nodes will probably also become nodes of activity, provided that it's allowed. And the productive friction, the idea of productive friction and thinking about mobility transitions from that perspective is also about what type of activity, of economic activity is allowed. That's what I've been asking. That's like how I've used the concept to think about the broader transformations, the structural transformations of the city. I've documented that here at the motorbike centric city, when Vietnamese cities were at motorbike peak, so let's say about 10 years ago, this was a time when about 25% of all of the population was working in home-based businesses. So home-based businesses, we're talking typically, like specifically about people who run a business from the ground floor of their homes. And home-based businesses also include street vendors. So we're talking about 25% of the population, I've argued, whose livelihood depends on productive friction. And this sector of the economy is really critical to the economic transition of a country like Vietnam that is a rapidly developing country. So the question I've asked is, as we're restructuring, through transportation policy, we're basically necessarily impacting the network of productive friction. What happens, to the people who rely on productive friction for their livelihood? It's not just an economic argument, it's also an urban vibrancy argument. In many ways, it's cultural. The street life that we observe on Vietnamese streets, there's something cultural to it. So yeah, there is a need to optimize transportation networks for sure. We cannot sustain cities that are high level of predictive friction everywhere. We might want to optimize, and maybe AI can help us with this, but we also don't want to erase all of it. So that's like how I've been thinking about it, and thinking about mobility transitions through this lens. In terms of how I have studied it, I came to the concept using what we use grounded theory methods. So really conceptualizing from the ground up. So from talking to people, like conducting interviews, dozens, hundreds of interviews about people's mobility practices. I've talked to residents, talking about where they go every day, where they stop on the way, and so on. I've talked with street vendors and business owners along the way. I've done a lot of ethnographic field work and participant observations as well. What Harvey Hansen, who's also written quite a bit about motorbike mobility in Vietnam, has called motorbike ethnography. So really observing and experiencing the city from the back of a motorbike. So I've done quite a bit of that over the years. And I continue to go back to Vietnam as often as I can. Basically, I try to go every year. I was there last month. And the plan is to track this transition from motorbikes to cars and transit over time. I have 10 years of observations now, and at some point I am writing a book on this topic using 10 years of data now.
Nice. I look forward to reading that book for sure. I mean, the idea of motorbike ethnographies of a city sounds fascinating. There is a kind of equity consideration here, right? Like these productive frictions mean different things for different people, depending on kind of what social group they're part of, or what kind of where they sit in society. And I also wonder simultaneously that as we're talking about rapid transit systems and kind of modern public transit systems, and we're thinking about AI as improving the efficiency of these systems, is there a tension here that we need to think about in terms of, on one hand, using technology to improve the efficiency of these systems, but at the same time, like you're saying, it taking away a lot of those productive frictions, and maybe those frictions are particularly relevant for people of certain kind of socio-economic classes, or who live in particular areas. So just thinking about the equity point here as well, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that based on your research.
Yeah, for sure. The way that I started thinking about the motorbike centric city was informed by, we don't really know how it works. We don't really know. We are planning, through practice, we are planning on changing it. So, other reports I was writing, as a consultant before joining academia, were all about transit-oriented development in the future, those new mass transit systems, how they would structure the city and shape the future of transportation and so on. But I was taking issues with the fact that we were planning the city of the future without knowing too well how the city of the present works. And the present city was indeed very different. The motorbike-centric city had not been thoroughly documented. So I started with using all sorts of data that I could find, and approaching it through that lens of equity. And the main question driving my research was like, how well does it serve the people and people of all walks of life? My starting point is that the motorbike centric city was all in all quite equitable, in the sense that, going back to data probably still today, the largest travel survey that was ever conducted was in 2014 by the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. I had access to this data. We were talking about 60,000 observations, like a good sample, a really good sample of Ho Chi Minh City's population. That's the data I analyzed. But we found that on average, the commuting time was 15 minutes. We were at motorbike peak by then, meaning that I think it was 92% of all households had at least one, and more than 80% of all trips were made by motorbike at the time. I'm already talking about it in the past because these shares have already declined quite a bit with the rise of car use and so on. But yeah, 15-minute commuting time. And one thing that I did as well is like comparing, by socioeconomic groups, so low income, middle income, high income, by gender, how many destinations and what type of destinations do people reach every day. And we found basically equality. We found that the motorbike centric city was actually a very equal city in terms of like how the good access that it was providing the people. And then when we think about, just think about a mass transit system, it's really interesting. I mean, I'm all in, I want to say, sometimes I do hear the pushback, like in like, well, yeah, you're romanticizing the motorbike centric city, which is polluting, which is, high emission, high accident. There are a lot of negative externalities, as we call them, associated with the motorbike. But there are also a lot of positive externalities that have been understated, I would say, in policy through. But yeah, the motorbike centric city was very egalitarian from a transportation perspective, and the new forms of mobility that are coming in are impacting this balance. Like, think about every car that is added to traffic. Cars take disproportionate amount of space. We're talking about a context where roads are narrow and they're extremely busy. They were already extremely busy when you only had motorbikes, which are small, let's say micro mobilities in some ways. Every car that you add to traffic makes congestion significantly worse for everyone else, makes, the transportation experience indeed much safer for the people inside the car, but much more dangerous for everyone else around, especially people on motorbikes and bicycles and pedestrians around those cars. So there's something quite inequitable in that process. It makes the experience less conducive to productive friction for the people inside the car, for sure. But it also makes, the opportunity to make a livelihood of the connection to traffic. It removes it for the people on the sidewalks. If we take the example of the mass transit systems, I find it fascinating. I spend most of, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, in a context where the mass transit system is seen as, true public service. It's like the last resort mobility option for people who have no other option, typically who don't have a car in a very car-centric environment. So it's like really thought about public transit systems over there are thought about as the most equitable transportation policy you can think of. In the context of Vietnam, where mass transit systems are coming to compete with a form of mobility that serves everyone and serves every types of transportation moves, really well. Those mass transit systems that serve people who, I mean, they will serve primarily people who commute from a more like suburban environment to an urban core type of job, a job that you will have in the CBD, in the city center. We're talking about white collar people. Only white collar people live that way. The type of transportation, the type of mobility that people who are in the home based businesses we were talking about, or we're talking about very different mobility patterns every day. We're talking about a lot of small moves, and we're not talking about a daily commute. We're talking about a lot of small moves like from your providers to, the people you care for every day, the children you pick up and drop off. Like, we're talking about very different patterns that a daily commute, your system that supports a daily commute won't support these types of moves. I'm not saying that the mass transit system itself is inequitable. Like, it serves a certain segment, a certain need for that is definitely there and needs to be met, but we should not undermine the other needs that are being met by the current systems.
Thanks for that, Hue-Tan. I think some of the examples that you provided were really powerful in helping thinking through this tension that you spoke of. Kris, maybe I can kind of, move the conversation to a slightly different direction now. So you're also an advocate for open access data. And so could you tell us a little bit how this fits into the AI and mobility discussion, especially in addressing challenges in AI adoption? And perhaps as you're thinking about that or talking to us about that, if you could also reflect a little bit about along with the opportunities of open access in the context of mobility, also some of the risks that might come with open access data, such as misuse, or where only or the ability of select few actors to be able to use that data.
Yeah. Well, I really think, openness in itself should be the backbone of AI in mobility. Currently, I see, as I mentioned earlier, I see data governance a lot of mess, especially in developing countries. You all know that AI models require diverse data sets to train effectively. But currently, what I see in Asia Pacific, in Asia itself, mobility data is often, siloed. Different ministries handle different transit data and mobility data themselves. So there's a split. As I mentioned earlier, we need to understand the nature of traffic management in that particular country and city. Example, in the Philippines, there's a split between the national agencies, the local governments, and the private operators when it comes to especially on the data, the transit data, the mobility data themselves. So with having an open access data, I think it can address this data fragmentation, and later on, it will drive innovation. In Seoul, open transit data basically spawned 100 or even more mobility apps serving millions of their users. So open access data really drive innovation. Next, it also builds trust. And trust is really important when it comes to digital transformation. I think building trust equals sustainability or continuity of all digital projects or of all AI mobility projects, especially, as I mentioned earlier, in countries where the change of leadership affect the continuity of any and all projects. Even if it's really good, if there's a change of leadership, the continuity will stop. So building trust is really important when it comes to continuity. My training in data stewardship before also showed me how open data makes AI more less of a black box. So AI systems, we all know, has a lot of skepticism when it comes to implementing it on the ground. So open data sets can allow third party audits. Publicly accessible open data portals let citizens understand how AI driven decision making has been made. Does it includes new bike lanes, jeepney routes and such? If it considered those, the cultural aspect that Wei-Tam is mentioning earlier. So last but not the least, I think open access data sparks collaboration. So at Smart City, I always say that disjointed systems, the national, then the local traffic management, lead to inefficiencies. So we can always use open data like the one produced by, I think India is very active when it comes to open street mapping. The one that is produced by open street mapping organizations to map informal transit routes in the communities, because usually the ones that has data are the formal ones, but how about the informal ones, like the one that was mentioned by Wei-Tam earlier? How about the micro mobility ones, right? So filling in the gaps, the official records might miss. So open data standards can really enable unified solutions. Of course, open data has risks, data misuse, power imbalances, and capacity. I think capacity is a huge one. Many government always struggle when it comes using the data they have, the open data that they have. In the Philippines, I noticed that very few local governments have dedicated data teams. In fact, IT teams or data teams are not included in the organizational chart in the city themselves. So that's another issue. So to fix this, of course, we need strong governance. And I think developed countries already show this. And of course, on top of data governance, we need to realize that the government cannot do it alone. Partnerships are really important. So involving communities like open street mapping through participatory mapping keeps data relevant, keeps data updated, and of course trusted as well.
Thanks for that, Chris, on laying out both, I think, the opportunities and the risks. And like you said, there is a lot of kind of momentum around this conversation in the Indian context already. Maybe just kind of, using that as a segue to move on to the last segment of our chat together on the way forward. So, Chris, for investors looking to support AI for mobility initiatives in Asia, what would be your top recommendations?
I always say focus on the local needs first, and of course, equity. We need to understand the local context first before we plan and what they call before we implement any and all digital transformation projects. Like for example, in Jakarta, where 60% of the city floods seasonally, AI can be used to optimize emergency routes. In the Philippines, 40% of the rural areas lack transit, so perhaps focus on projects that can boost logistics as well. So make solutions affordable, of course multilingual, and of course offline as well, because 53% in at least in the Philippines has hardly no access when it comes to hardly internet access, right? Next would be, I want to go back to the openness. Invest in openness standards and focus on capacity and longevity. I always say this, that in countries where leadership changes and the political landscape is quite volatile, it hinders a continuity of any projects. So even if the city bought that particular software, if there's a change of leadership and there's no buy-in and clamor from the citizens to put that particular project back, the continuity of the project will just be questionable. So you also need to train local governments and of course community, because when I work with Development Academy of the Philippines, I noticed that in order for a particular project or initiative or software to be adopted, you really need to train the local people how to use it and not rely on the vendors, on the vendors themselves. And of course, focus on data governance. We cannot just rely on AI. We need to make sure that the data that we have to train the AI system is inclusive and representative of any and all mobility standards there as well.
Yeah, I think that those are really important and essential kind of ingredients for anyone kind of investing in this space. Hue-Tam, same question back to you to close our discussion. So, if you were to advise a startup developing an AI solution for optimizing transportation in the region, what would your kind of two pieces of wisdom be?
I think that's a really good question, and I definitely want to echo Kris's point about equity. I think I would really encourage. Maybe we do have an opportunity if we want to be, I don't know, enthusiastic about the possibilities of AI. I think there are reasons to be, and at the same time, there are reasons to be mindful of the risks of maybe reproducing or going even further into practices that have, for the longest time, we've been thinking about one of the problems I see in transportation planning is how we've tended to think about the transportation infrastructure as pipes. Thinking about the things that flow through the pipes are atoms, not people. Not people with their own experiences and their own challenges and their own needs. And if there was a way to move beyond this, which has been a major flaw of transportation planning since for at least 50 years, is there a way to use AI to break through that hurdle, or are we just reproducing the same thing and doing it even worse? I think these are kind of the two pathways ahead of us. And if there was a way to think about AI, in ways that can help us plan for optimize different transportation experiences. Are there ways to optimize safe routes to school for children, or safe routes to home for women, or, accessible routes for people with mobility challenges, or, thinking about various transportation experiences from from people's perspectives in ways that make these experiences actually safer and more accessible for everyone. I think that would be ideal. Going back to several points that Kris made that I think are really interesting. I think the word optimizing comes up often. I feel like when it comes to the use of AI and large amounts of data, processing large amounts of data, in thinking about our transportation systems, I think there are opportunities to optimize certain things, definitely to optimize traffic flows, to optimize, in the case of emergencies and so on. I see this potential for optimization, but I just wanted to highlight that, if any startup wanted to invest in that space, maybe optimizing transportation experiences, but thinking about them from the perspective of different people with different needs, different challenges. I think that would be ideal.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's such an important point. And I think the kind of sticky bit here, or the challenging bit here, is really that how do we incentivize those kind of investments where the return on investment may not be as quick or as immediate or as large, with kind of providing for different social contexts, different social groups, different social identities, and ensuring that the benefits of these interventions are equitably spread. But I think some of the points that you both have raised are crucial, if we're going to be using AI for mobility and for kind of what you call transit oriented, to support transit oriented development. And that framing itself, I think, provides us a really interesting kind of entry point to think about how we can use AI and other related technologies. So thank you both for sharing your work with us and for taking out the time from your busy schedules to spend with us on the podcast. And I'm sure our listeners really appreciate that too. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. We'll be back next month with more conversations at the intersection of climate change and artificial intelligence in Asia. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up for our monthly newsletter at codegreen.asia. I'm Urvishya Neja, and on behalf of Digital Futures Lab, thank you for listening.